Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, August 20th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Netanyahu backs the U.S. Gaza proposal that includes his own demands. So after a meeting with Secretary of State Antony Blinken in Jerusalem on Monday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a statement backing the new Gaza hostage and ceasefire proposal from the U.S., which includes Netanyahu's demands and does not include a permanent ceasefire. So Netanyahu's office said in a statement, quote, "The Prime Minister reiterated Israel's commitment to the current American proposal on the release of our hostages, which takes into account Israel's security needs, which he strongly insists on," end quote. So according to the Times of Israel, this was the first time that Netanyahu publicly backed the U.S. proposal, even though it included his demands. What was new about it were the things that Netanyahu wanted to be inserted, including no permanent ceasefire, Israel maintaining control of the Gaza-Egypt border, and a few other things. And Hamas rejected the proposal a day earlier due to those conditions. And when I first saw this, I suspected that Netanyahu waited a couple days to come out publicly in favor of this deal to make sure that Hamas was not going to accept it. And then later I saw that Israeli officials actually told Axios that Netanyahu only said he accepted the U.S. proposal because he was sure that Hamas would reject it. So he's still doing everything he can to make sure there is no ceasefire deal. It's very obvious to anyone who has been paying attention following this thing. But yet you have Blinken and the Biden administration now saying, oh, Netanyahu accepts it. Now it's all up to Hamas. When it's just realistically, it's so obvious that Netanyahu is sabotaging this. So Netanyahu began demanding these conditions. The background of this, I've covered this a lot, but it was essentially Hamas agreed to the Biden ceasefire proposal from May, after asking for stronger assurances on the permanent ceasefire, which was a response to Netanyahu saying he wouldn't agree to a permanent ceasefire. So when they actually got Hamas to agree to the ceasefire proposal that Biden laid out, that's when Netanyahu added all these demands. And now Hamas is saying that they want to go back to the Biden ceasefire proposal that Biden claimed was an Israeli proposal. So in Israel, Blinken, said all these things, how it's time to get a deal done now. There's no excuse. We have to implement this ceasefire. But it's a complete joke. I mean, the U.S. is not going to put the pressure on Israel that it would need to get a deal done, that it could. The U.S. could tell Israel no more weapons, no more political cover at the UN, none of that. You need to agree to a ceasefire right now. And that would make it happen. They need that military support from the U.S. and other types of political support from the U.S. But they're not going to do that. At least it doesn't seem like it at the moment. And Blinken also said this is the last chance. This might be the last chance at a ceasefire. Again, a big concession here that was made by the U.S. Maybe not a big concession, but they have given, it looks like, if you remember a few weeks ago, there was these reports that said the U.S. is willing to give Israel a guarantee that it could restart this genocidal war in Gaza after any ceasefire deal. And it looks like they have given them that based on this new proposal. So just not looking good, the chances here of a ceasefire. All right, so the next one here, Egypt okays Israeli control of Gaza border and trade for Rafah reopening. So this is from Middle East Eye. It's a report from them citing Egyptian sources who said that Egypt and Israel have reached an understanding that would allow an Israeli security presence along the Egyptian-Gaza border in exchange for the Rafah crossing being reopened and operated by Palestinians. According to an Egyptian diplomat, an official at the General Intelligence Service, and another at the Military Intelligence, Israel presented two options for the border area known as the Philadelphia Corridor. One is for Israel to maintain boots on the ground as it has since its military pushed into the area in May. The second would be to replace the troops with an underground barrier, electronic monitoring equipment, and occasional patrols. So occasional patrols mean Israeli troops would still have a presence there. Egypt said that it would agree to the options if the Palestinian factions, particularly Hamas, were on board. However, Hamas, which is currently battling Israel in Gaza, insists it will not agree to any ceasefire deal that does not ensure the Israelis totally withdraw from the enclave, including the Philadelphia Corridor. So this is something Egypt might be willing to go along with, but it's not something it looks like Hamas is going to agree to. And this was a big thing about these demands from Netanyahu. When, this was one of his new demands was that Israel would maintain control of the Philadelphia Corridor. And that was apparently added after Egypt agreed, because Netanyahu was saying that they have to prevent weapons smuggling into Gaza from Egypt. So Egypt, and this was a few months back now, agreed to build some sort of underground barrier. And the U.S. said that it would fund it if, Israel pulled out from the border. But then Netanyahu went ahead and said, no, we need to maintain control of that. So it's like at every turn, he's done things to try to make sure a deal doesn't happen. So we'll see if this, plays out anymore. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 35 in one day as Gaza hospitals warn of collapse. So meanwhile, the slaughter in Gaza continues. This article is from Al Jazeera. Israeli airstrikes have killed at least 35 Palestinians across the Gaza Strip, medical sources told Al Jazeera. And this is Tuesday. This was on Monday. So it was the airstrikes on Monday that killed at least 35 people. And hospitals are warning that children are at risk of dying due to a fuel shortage. Among the casualties on Monday were 13 people killed by Israeli forces in Gaza City. At least 9 of them were killed in an air attack targeting a group of Palestinians in the United Nations-run Shati refugee camp in western Gaza City. Meanwhile, earlier in the day, another 4 people were killed in the Israeli bombing of a civilian car in the Az-Zarqa neighborhood in northern Gaza City. There's also Israeli warplanes firing at homes in southern Gaza City, so it's across the Gaza Strip that Israel is launching airstrikes and artillery strikes and having troops on the ground. And separately, in northern Gaza, Hussan Abu Safiya, the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, told Al Jazeera that 11 sick children in the nursery and intensive care units are at risk of death within hours due to fuel shortages that threaten to shut down the facility. So everything, the slaughter and the blockade continue. All right, so the next one here, DNC protesters to Harris, Israel arms embargo or no vote. So this is another article from Al Jazeera about the protests outside of the DNC in Chicago. The DNC, the Democratic National Convention, started on Monday, and there were some big protests outside. I saw some videos of protesters like breaking through some sort of barricade at one point. And so this is going to go on throughout the week as the DNC goes on. And Al Jazeera has a story here. They spoke with some protesters. One of them said, quote, "Are we for mass murdering babies or are we against it? To me, it's a pretty simple equation," end quote. And this is one of thousands of protesters who blanketed the grass of Union Park, blocks away from the Democratic National Convention, to demand an end to United States support for Israel's war. As the Democrats gathered at the convention to present Vice President Kamala Harris as their presidential nominee, several Palestinian rights advocates told Al Jazeera that they will not vote for Harris unless she agrees to an arms embargo against Israel. The demonstration, dubbed the March on the DNC, also demanded an immediate and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. And so, again, some of these protesters are saying that they don't think she's going to be much different than Biden. I don't really see that there's a reason to think that. And I think if we do see any good rhetoric from her this week, it'll probably be trying to get these votes. But hopefully this pressure does something. Hopefully it means something. I saw AOC. I watched a little bit of her speech. She says Kamala Harris is working tirelessly to get a ceasefire in Gaza. Well, how is she doing that? She's campaigning. And the administration she's in keeps approving military aid and arms sales for Israel. So how exactly is she working tirelessly to get a ceasefire? I mean, it sounds like a joke to me, but we'll see what happens this week. I think it's going to be pretty tense with these. It's a big embarrassment for the Democrats. The thing is, will we see protesters actually inside the convention, people that are there? I'm sure there's going to be some form of that. So it'll be an interesting week in Chicago. All right, the next one here. Israeli strikes on Yemen are a possible war crime. So Human Rights Watch released a report on Monday that said the July 20th Israeli airstrikes targeting Yemen's Red Sea port of Hodeidah could be a war crime since the attack caused disproportionate harm to civilians. The Israeli airstrikes, which came in response to a Houthi drone attack that killed one civilian in Tel Aviv, targeted oil storage tanks, shipping cranes, and a power plant. The strikes killed 6 civilians, all employees of the Yemen Petroleum Company, and caused an estimated $20 million in damage. So this Human Rights Watch report said, quote, the attacks appeared to cause disproportionate harm to civilians and civilian objects. Serious violations of the laws of war committed willfully, that is deliberately or recklessly, are war crimes, end quote. According to the Yemen Data Project, the Israeli attack resulted in more civilian harm than the hundreds of strikes that the U.S. and the U.K. have launched on Yemen since January combined. So Israel caused more civilian harm in this one round of airstrikes than the hundreds of strikes that the U.S. has launched on Yemen, according to the Yemen Data Project. And they put the death toll in the Israeli attack at 9 civilians. Human Rights Watch said it was 6, and that's what I saw the Houthis say, but Yemen Data Project said 9 civilians were killed and 83 were wounded. It said that the U.S. and British bombing campaign has killed a total of 19 civilians and injured 55 others. So the U.S. and U.K. have killed more civilians, but talking total casualties, the Israeli attack caused more civilian casualties, and also targeting Hodeidah. This is a major point of entry for aid and just imports in general. It was under blockade from 2015 to 2022 during the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war on Yemen against the Houthis. And as far as I understand it, the blockade still hasn't been fully lifted. There are still some restrictions. But it was a starvation blockade on Yemen, similar to what we see in Gaza. It involved airstrikes on all sorts of civilian infrastructure, food infrastructure, water infrastructure, and I mean things like farms and fishing boats and things like that were targeted, and water treatment plants. There was the biggest modern day cholera epidemic in Yemen as a result of that siege. So just completely brutal. And since 2022, since the Saudi Houthi ceasefire has held, the Yemenis living in Houthi-controlled Yemen, which is where about 70 to 80% of the population lives, they've had some relief. But this new U.S. bombing campaign and these Israeli strikes on Hodeidah, which caused all this damage, really threaten kind of pushing them over the edge again. So, and the death toll in that U.S.-backed war on Yemen, according to the UN, as of 2021, and this is considered a low estimate, at least 377,000 people were killed, and more than half died of starvation due to the siege. So it gives you an idea of, how brutal and large scale this thing was. So Yemen just started crawling out of that, and then the U.S. and the U.K. started bombing Yemen in response to the Houthi attacks on shipping, which is their response to the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. So the whole situation is just a mess. And the U.S. and UK, it's just escalated the situation. The Houthis aren't backing down. It's not going to happen. But they continue to bomb Yemen. Just the other day, I saw a press release from U.S. Central Command that they launched more strikes in Yemen. All right, so the next one here, Israeli soldier killed in Hezbollah drone strike in northern Israel. This one is from Jason Ditz. So Hezbollah launched a flurry of drones against the northern Israeli military target. One of the drones exploded, killing Israeli Chief Warrant Officer Mahmoud Amaria and wounding several others, one of them seriously. Israel reported that 3 of the 5 drones were intercepted. So Israel responded. They launched a series of attacks across southern Lebanon. 2 Hezbollah members were reported killed in one of those attacks. And then in another area, Israeli attacks wounded at least 8 civilians. Again, daily strikes across the border continue. We still haven't seen a big Hezbollah escalation in response to Israel's airstrike in Beirut that killed one of their senior military commanders. All right, so the next one here, Zelensky says Russia's red lines are a bluff. So Zelensky is really talking some smack right now about the Russians. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Monday that the Ukrainian assault on Russia's Kursk Oblast shows that Moscow's red lines and threats of retaliation are a bluff. Zelensky made the comments while criticizing the U.S. and its NATO allies for not allowing Ukraine to use Western-provided weapons to launch long-range strikes inside Russian territory. He said, quote, "We are witnessing a significant ideological shift. The naive, illusory concept of so-called red lines regarding Russia, which dominated the assessment of the war by some partners, has crumbled apart these days," end quote. So he's taking aim at the U.S. there, saying this idea, this concern of escalation is naive and that they've been illusional. It's kind of strong wording that he's using against his Western backers that make his war effort possible. And essentially saying that, and this is something we've seen obviously from him throughout the war, that don't worry about escalation. The escalation is the Russian invasion. Anything beyond that, don't worry about it. Now, this is also someone who has tried to push for direct NATO intervention, which of course could lead to World War III and nuclear war. So he doesn't seem to be concerned about those risks. And he also claimed that if Ukraine had been allowed to fire NATO weapons deep inside Russia, it wouldn't have had to launch the offensive in Kursk. He's saying if we could just fire missiles into the territory long range, we wouldn't have had to invade. He claimed that long-range strikes would stop Russia's gains in eastern Ukraine, which have become more rapid amid the fighting in Kursk. He said, quote, "You must realize both here and in the capitals where you work that Ukraine is separated from stopping the advance of the Russian army at the front by only one decision, which we expect from our partners. And this is a decision on long-range capabilities," end quote. So while the U.S. hasn't signed off on long-range strikes in Russia, it is allowing Ukraine to use U.S.-provided weapons in Kursk. And Russian officials have said U.S.-provided HIMARS have been used in the assault. The invasion came a few months after President Biden gave Ukraine the green light to use U.S. weapons in strikes on Russian border regions. So a U.S.-backed invasion of Russia, there's huge escalation risks here, despite Zelensky downplaying them. Throughout the war, we have seen Russia escalate directly in response to attacks on its territory. The example I always use is that Russia did not start these large-scale bombings of Ukrainian energy infrastructure until October 2022, months into their invasion. And they started that in response to the first bombing of the Crimean Bridge that connects Crimea to the Russian mainland. And we've seen, you see the more of the attacks when Ukraine first started hitting the Russian oil refineries with drones. Russia really stepped up its missile and drone bombardment, across Ukraine. So what are we going to see in response to Kursk? I think right now Russia is focused on fighting there and making the gains in eastern Ukraine. They have been launching missile strikes in Kiev. But if you look at the map here from South Front on August 19th, in some areas, again, you see the Russians pushing the Ukrainians back closer to the border. But then there's also some spots where they said that the Ukrainian forces are advancing. So this isn't something that's going to be over quickly. But the Russian response. It's something to be very concerned about. You saw Russia say that if British weapons were used in their territory, this was just a few months ago, that they would target British military sites in Ukraine and beyond. So, we're at a really, this is the closest that, the U.S. and Russia have been to being in direct war, I think, with the U.S. actually supporting and NATO supporting an invasion of Russian territory. All right, so the next one here, Russia says that talks with Ukraine are impossible after the Kursk offensive. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said Monday that President Vladimir Putin has made clear talks with Ukraine are now impossible following the Ukrainian assault on Russia's Kursk Oblast. Lavrov said, quote, "The president said it very clearly that following attacks or even incursion on the Kursk region, any talks are impossible," end quote. So Ukrainian officials have said that the purpose of the invasion was to gain leverage for future negotiations with Russia, but Moscow's reaction to the incursion signals that the assault would only delay peace talks. The Washington Post reported on Saturday that Russia and Ukraine were due to hold indirect negotiations in Qatar on a potential agreement to stop targeting each other's energy infrastructure, but it was derailed by the Kursk offensive. So Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, it looked like, the headline said that she denied that these talks, that she denied the report. But really what it looked like she said was that Russia was not involved in any direct or indirect talks with Ukraine that could have been derailed by the Kursk offensive. According to those reports, so the talks hadn't actually started yet. And Lavrov mentioned the reports, but he only denied rumors that Russia and Ukraine were in talks before having Qatar brokered talks. So it's not exactly clear if they're denying the report altogether or just denying some rumors around it. But either way, it does look like this says, before Ukraine launched this invasion of Kursk, Zelensky signaled that he was open to holding peace talks with Russia, and it was a significant shift in his position. He previously rejected the idea of diplomacy with Russia altogether unless Russia withdrew from the territory it had captured in Ukraine, as well as Crimea. And Russia actually expressed an openness to what Zelensky was saying, but now they're saying, this was just a ploy while they're, he was saying that while they were plotting this big attack on Kursk. And when we're talking about this topic, we always have to mention that Russia and Ukraine, there have not been any peace talks since March and April of 2022, and those peace talks were discouraged by the U.S. There was a real chance of a deal. The U.S. said, and NATO said, no, we'll fund you. We'll give you, $40 billion. That's right after the peace talks fell apart was when the U.S. approved that big first $40 billion weapons military aid package for Ukraine. That's when you saw Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin say that one of the U.S.'s goals here is to weaken Russia. That's when it became very clearly a proxy war between the U.S. and Russia. All right, so the next one here, Lithuania is building bases to house German troops. This one is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Lithuania has started construction on a military base that will house over 4,000 German soldiers. The facility will be located just miles from the border shared with Belarus. So this is a big investment. It's going to cost over $1.1 billion to build, which that seems like a lot of money for a military base. It's not a huge base if it's 4,000 troops, but he said the German deployment represents deterrence to push the Russians out. And this is kind of a big deal because this is Germany's first permanent deployment, I believe, since it's the first time they're deployed anywhere on a permanent basis since World War II. And Lithuania, this is the total is going to be 4,800 German troops by 2027. That's the goal. There's already a few dozen there. They made a big deal when they sent them off for this deployment. German troops have, of course, been deployed for other reasons, including in Afghanistan and everything. But this is, what they call a permanent deployment. And this is just part of the NATO military buildup in Eastern Europe. All right, so the next one here, Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels collide in the South China Sea. So Chinese and Philippine Coast Guard vessels collided in the South China Sea on Monday near the Sabina Shoal in the disputed South China Sea. So the two sides are trading blame for the incident, which happened despite diplomatic efforts between Beijing and Manila to cool tensions in the waters. So this shoal is part of the Spratly Islands, and it is claimed by China, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Taiwan. So this is kind of what you see. Typically, they trade blame. The Chinese Coast Guard said that the Philippine vessel illegally entered the waters near the Sabina Shoal, which is about 86 miles west of the Philippine island province of Palawan. And China accused the Philippine boat of purposely colliding with the Chinese vessel. The Philippines denies that and says that it was the Chinese Coast Guard that rammed this Philippine boat, and then they actually rammed another one. So there was a total of 2 Philippine vessels that they said were damaged in this incident, in this confrontation. And, you know, the reason why we cover these incidents is because this area has turned into a potential flashpoint for a war between the U.S. and China, because the U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines. That means if the Philippines comes under attack, the U.S. has pledged to defend them, to intervene, and go to war for them. And whenever these things happen, I didn't see a statement yet from the U.S., but I'm sure they usually release them after these collisions, or when they're asked about them. They always say that this mutual defense treaty applies to attacks on Philippine vessels in the South China Sea. So that means if this maritime dispute turns hot, the U.S. is saying it will intervene and fight China for the Philippines. So, you know, the U.S. is very committed to this, and it has been strengthening its military ties with the Philippines, kind of emboldening the Philippines to push back harder against China's claims to the areas that it also claims. And the U.S. recently announced $500 million in military aid for the Philippines, and this was pulled out of the big $95 billion foreign military aid bill that Biden signed into law in April. And you kind of think of the implications of that. You know, this was what they call, you know, an emergency supplemental spending package. You know, it's an emergency to get the money to Ukraine because they're in this war with Russia. It's an emergency to get this money to Israel because they're slaughtering, you know, we need to help them kill more Palestinians. And then the spending, it includes spending for Taiwan and elsewhere in kind of the Asia Pacific region as part of a buildup against China. So from China's view, the American legislatures think that the situation is such an emergency in Southeast Asia that we have to pass this aid to help, you know, prepare for this future war with China. So, you know, it goes to show kind of the attitude in Washington about all this. At the same time, you know, they do also call things emergencies just so they can get more money. But I think kind of including it, rolling it in with these 2 hot wars that are going on, sends a message to China. So always something to keep an eye on. And China has said that the U.S. is escalating the situation in the South China Sea by being involved, saying that the U.S. is instigating and pushing the Philippines. All right, so the last story here, Senator Rand Paul says that U.S. support for Saudi Arabia is a national disgrace. So this article is from The Intercept, from Nick Turse. If you remember, maybe about a week or so ago, I covered a story that Nick Turse had saying that the Saudis have not paid their bill for the U.S. refueling them during that brutal war on Yemen. The U.S. was refueling the Saudi fighter jets that were bombing Yemen, and they have an outstanding bill, I think, for about $15 million, even though the Saudi royal family is worth over $1 trillion, I think. And Senator Rand Paul gave The Intercept a very strong statement. He was good. Senator Rand Paul leaded some of the efforts in the Senate to end U.S. support for the war in Yemen, to get the U.S. out of it, to restrict U.S. weapon sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so in response to this story, he said in a statement, quote, "Yemen's children will grow up knowing Saudi Arabia's brutal war that caused so much slaughter and starvation was made possible with American support. Now, the billionaire crown prince apparently will not reimburse America's taxpayers for refueling his warplanes. Saudi Arabia's delinquency and our government's arrogant lack of transparency further demonstrates that America's servility to this autocratic regime is a national disgrace, end quote. So pretty strong words from Rand Paul. I wish he would say something like that about Israel. I've heard him basically say that he supports aid to Israel, which is unfortunate because he's good on a lot of other foreign policy things. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Jeff Cohen, fired by MSNBC for opposing the Iraq War. Phil Donahue was courage personified. Phil Donahue just passed away. I believe maybe it was Monday or Sunday, but he has passed away. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, Washington needlessly entangles its small allies. One from Jonathan Cook, nothing changed since 1948, except now Israel's excuses don't work. One from Anatole Levin, stop treating Georgia as a creature of the U.S. and the West. And one from Michael Tracy, asking generals in charge of nukes tough questions. Good article from Tracy at his Substack. He asked the head of Stratcom about concerns about President Biden not being mentally fit to run for president again, being in charge of the nuclear codes and everything. And he also asked some stuff about Ukraine to Brown, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's good that at least one journalist is concerned about these things. They didn't really answer the questions is essentially, the Stratcom guy said, nothing to worry about with Biden. But it was interesting. Brown didn't say one way or another if the U.S. was aware of Ukraine's plans to invade Kursk. So please go check all of that out. You could always support this show by telling your friends about it, sharing it, telling them about antiwar.com. Like, subscribe, comment. I appreciate everyone who does. Follow us on social media, Instagram and X. You can find our stuff there. I will be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.